Or I could put it on your head. Alright, we're all giving our attention to Al.
All right, over here
What do you have?
in the center we have a picture of Sir Henry Bessemer, the inventor of the Bessemer process. Essentially, it was a steel process that could turn pig iron into a stronger, more flexible form of steel that we actually use today. Over here we have a steel beam. It's known as an I-beam. You probably already know that. But this is a very infamous building in New York. Now, steel was very important to the construction of modern buildings. We could build higher, build stronger, without having to use, yes, and build faster, without having to use stone, like heavy stone blocks entirely. We could use simple things like concrete or brick to really build most of our buildings. Without steel, we wouldn't have been able to use the maximum amount of space for a little cost, really, in both environment and also actual monetary costs. Next slide. Another building that remarks the greatness of steel and also glass is the Crystal Palace in London. Now, this palace used to showcase all the exhibitions of the world, specifically technological, biological, archaeological, various academic subjects that people saw on a daily basis usually. Next slide. It's actually been taken down. Yes, Nikola Tesla. Now, in the center we have Marconi, the inventor of the radio, and also we have Thomas Alva Edison. Now, why actually put all of these, well, basically Americans in AP Europe was because their inventions were far-reaching. As I said before yesterday, industrialism and invention were a very international thing. They expanded beyond the borders that we had. Now, Tesla, I also put Tesla and Marconi there because Marconi was the descendant of immigrants. Tesla was a direct Serbian, so now we know Tesla built the Tesla coil, AC current for electricity, better light bulbs than even Thomas Alva Edison, and also most of the materials that Marconi used for his first radio, which ended up in a very interesting patent infringement case. Next slide. Now, over here, we have all three of the inventors of the internal combustion engine. Sorry about this. The first one is Gottlieb Daimler. The second is Nicholas Otto, and the last is Etienne Lumière. These men helped contribute to what we now have as the modern car engine. Now, the first internal combustion engine was actually being used mainly for factories and little trinkets. But eventually it was with the expansion of gas or oil, we were able to use it to power our cities. We were able to use it to begin to use for automobiles, although automobiles didn't really take off until in the 20th century with Henry Ford. And yes?
This has like something to do with it, but like nothing. But when did the Dodge Brothers come?
Dodge Brothers? Actually around the same century, the 20th, when Ford was starting out.
Alright.
Next
So
slide.
they just wanted to be.
Yes, automobiles weren't really particularly fashionable because there were only about 4 automobiles in the world at this time. Next slide. Back to actual travel machinery. Trains, steamboats, and eventually planes, but mainly trolley cars, were the main routes of transportation. With a train, you could expect to get, say, to California within at least 3 days. I mean, from Georgia to California within at least 3 days. In the past, using stagecoach, you probably would have actually encountered bandits. It would have taken a longer time, obviously. And then you might have run out of supplies. But trains actually provided you the chance with having at least a cushy inside to ride. all the way to your intended destination within a short time. Steamboats also provided the same thing. In the past, we had to use sails. With steamboats, all you needed was coal, a good steam engine, and there you had it. You could push against any type of prevailing wind or any type of current. So generally it made travel easy, specifically when you were considering things like imperialism, when you needed to transport, say, weapons and men to go maintain your provinces in the colonies. And trolley cars. In the city, this was a great boom because back then, some houses and shops could be a good amount of distance between each other. This kind of cleared things up between stagecoaches and various other things because trolley cars they don't need to be that necessarily large, and they can contain at least about 10 to 12 people. Next slide. Again, here is Etienne Lenoir's gas engine, Standard Oil, and also an automobile. Again, automobiles were not really fashionable. They were mainly for the rich. And most of the streets were being used for trolley cars and people to have parades and various other things in them. Mainly bodegas. Next slide. Now we have technological advancements in communications. Over here, we have the telegraph machine. Here, one of the first telephones. And over here, the first radio. And a phonograph. Now, all of these inventions were key to us communicating ideas over large distances, or over time even. The phonograph was basically a record player that could hold various records and recordings of people's voices. So say Gandhi gave a speech, this could essentially play that speech back to you. The same thing goes for the radio, although it can expand its reaches far wider, especially as we'll see later in World War II, and also in World War I. Now, with the telegraph machine, this was key specifically in America during the Civil War, where Abraham Lincoln actually used telegraphs to communicate over long distances to armies in the Union. And then in Europe, it was also key during the Franco-Prussian War, which it was also used for the very exact same thing. So these all had applications in warfare, daily life, and various other areas. Although they weren't specifically always taking off for people. They would always end up first in the hands of the rich. And by that I mean the telephone and the radio were exclusively for a few rich people. And they were very difficult to use at first. Next slide. Over here we have a cartoon about using the telephone, which kind of remarks how beautiful the invention was, but very difficult to use it. Next slide. Now we have industrialists. The first one that we have, Andrew Carnegie. The second, J.D. Rockefeller. The third, James Pierpont Morgan. And the last, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, all of these men, as I have stated, I am using a lot of Americans to basically portray this. But again, this shows how far international business was going. Carnegie was supplying steel to almost a majority of America, and also to foreign waters, where we'll actually see Carnegie steel in various other places, like in Belfast sometimes, for some of the rivets for, say, the Titanic. As with J.D. Rockefeller, he was an oil magnate, which actually served him well. His companies that branched out of Standard Oil were actually ExxonMobil and Chevron, primarily, and then a few other subsidiary companies. So again, the reach was very great because oil was needed for various things like electricity and then eventually cars. James Pierpont Morgan, he was just a man who actually dipped his hand into multiple areas. His father had already been a millionaire before, but Pierpont took it farther. He took his father's assets actually within international waters and expanded them within America to sell things like electricity, which he actually made GE. And then we have Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, excuse me. He expanded trains and railways inside America, and then also had a great deal of shipping companies outside of America. Next slide. And then we have the concepts of monopoly. Expansively, we began to see in this era that business began to dip its hand heavily within politics. In Britain, we saw that the middle class had great amounts of control within the British government, and that was almost impossible to say that they couldn't have. I mean, they provided most of the funds for the government. And then beyond that, it also led to, well, loose regulation for, say, child laborers, or women working too many hours, or men working too many hours in hazardous conditions and not being compensated for, say, a lost arm or cancer in a lung. Next slide.
Maybe it's it.
Woo!
Okay. Two things I wanted to